Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Phoebe Morad. I'm Director of Lutherans Restoring Creation, and I want to welcome you all here tonight. As we all get settled, and I'm going to keep admitting a few more people, I was going to share my screen and give you a little visual that was created by our wonderful board member, board president, Christian Koshman, put this little video together. And sometimes I think it's just easier to have a little video about what we do. I know everybody is getting more and more used to watching videos, so here's another one.
At Lutherans Restoring Creation, our goal is to inspire, connect, and include faith communities and their leaders in our shared concern for the well-being of God's creation. Through our volunteer-driven programming and resources, we hope to inspire others to care for God's creation through supporting the efforts of faith leaders and community members while advocating for change within and beyond the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. We aim to connect Lutherans around the country in our mutual concern through resource sharing and storytelling. And finally, we strive to include all communities in our work, from farmer to city dweller, as we learn new ways to celebrate God's creation while we advocate for its restoration. To learn more about Lutherans Restoring Creation or to partner in our work, visit lutheransrestoringcreation.org. Together, we can cultivate hope and healing for all.
So there we go. I figure sharing that visually is sometimes wraps it up nicer than whatever I could do in words, especially this late in the evening for me.
Hey, did you ever have one of those teachers or professors?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Someone else keeps talking. Hold on. There we go. Okay. But then again, while I'm trying to DJ everything, there we go. Okay. You can all hear me now, right? I didn't mute myself. Excellent. Okay, good. So welcome everyone. And I want to thank Bob Errett for offering to open us up with a land acknowledgement, because we're all on different land right now. What's nice about being all together from different places is that we get to hear a little bit of perspectives from different lands. And there is no right or wrong way to do this, but this is all about a process of us remembering and acknowledging that life didn't start here when the Christians showed up. So especially as a Caring for Creation group, I think we need to remember that and hear from one another. And I really appreciate that Bob was willing to do this. And I want to open up anyone who's interested in doing this and giving it a shot for our next meetings. Please do message me. I think it's a good process. Bob can tell you if he enjoyed it. Over to you, Bob.
My name is Bob Errett. I live in the city of Greensburg in the county of Westmoreland in the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania. And I'll give you a historical retrospect of the groups that lived here. Started with the Adena peoples. They are very ancient. I think they were pretty much the people of all of the eastern United States area. The Hopewell followed them, and there are creeks and rivers and villages in this area by that name. They were followed by the Monongahelias, which was the mound people that lived in around up through the 1100s AD. And then there was the Delaware, which were from the eastern part, which supplanted the Monongahela people. And the Osage came in from the west. So they were both here. Osage people came in from a long way away and actually had some work here in this area. You'll hear Osage in Kansas and Missouri. And then it was followed by the Mohawk people, who were built around the Mohawk River. And then by the Seneca Cayuga people, who sided with the Mohawk people and the Oneida and the other Algonquin tribes to form the Five Nations, which covered most of this area for a few hundred years before we as Christian people showed up. The thing about these people, as you notice by the names, most of those names had nothing to do with land. Their concept of land ownership didn't exist. was one of the reasons why, when we look back at what we gave to the Indians, we thought of it as being, well, we stole this land because we gave them a feather and they gave us, well, this land. The reality was that they didn't believe that you could own the land. They could own the waterways. So the waterways was what they used to name their peoples, not the land that they were on. Their food was fish. They lived via the water. So the concept of land ownership is strictly a European thing. No other peoples had that idea. They weren't, the land was not theirs. They were the land's. They belonged to the land. The land did not belong to them. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate that and taking the time. And I could tell last time when people were chatting what people had been on their land, you had a long list. And I was like, he knows what he's talking about, I bet. So I appreciate you sharing that, and again, encourage all of you to start the process. And it is, once you have a land acknowledgement, that's just one step in a process. So I do encourage you to figure that out individually and hopefully as a church as well, as a church family. I'm really thrilled. I was able to speak with Emilie Bouvier a while ago and so excited, especially about the community organizing that they're doing in the Minneapolis Synod. And always to have been impressed with a lot of the materials that come out of your Synod, Emilie. But also I'm just really excited to have you here to share your experience and perspectives. And she's going to be talking specifically about some really specific like rural power initiatives and cooperatives. But I want you to know also about the other side of Emilie that I think is really interesting, that she's an artist. So I hope it's okay with you, Emilie. I'm going to put in the chat a link to the other facet of you. I'm sure there are many facets, but I really want to share this because visually, to see some of the work that Emilie produces, I'm sure it feeds your work, and we could have a whole other connections call about art feeding your spirit. But anyways, I really want to lift that up as well, that you're only seeing one little facet of Emilie, and I really appreciate her taking the time to be with us tonight. And my hope is that what she has to share with us, we can continue to share with other people in our own context. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Emilie. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Phoebe. It is wonderful to be with you all tonight. It's such an honor to share some of our learnings and stories and yeah, share some good conversation. So again, my name is Emilie Bouvier. I'm the Director of Organizing for the Minneapolis Area Synod. And I'm greeting you from my office just south of downtown Minneapolis. But our synod covers a slightly larger geography, but smaller than a lot of synods. We have about a hour driving radius northwest and south of the downtown metro. So I'm greeting you from unceded Dakota land in close proximity to the native homelands of Lakota, Nakota, and Anishinaabe and Ho-Chunk nations. So I'll begin with that acknowledgement as well. Yeah, we're going to share a bit about particularly our work on local energy democracy issues. And I have some slides to share, so I'll just ask one moment of patience while I pull these up. And I will just say from the get-go that I will gladly share the link to these as well following our conversation tonight. Let me, here we go. Are we full screen here? Awesome. And actually, before we get started, so I am sharing this as someone who has been doing, serving both as director of our wider work on organizing for social change and on a variety of issues. But the longest part of my work in the Synod has been specifically on environmental justice issues. And I'm really pleased to welcome the newest member of our team, who's also on the call tonight. Jack is our new dedicated full-time environmental justice organizer. So I'm sharing this work out of kind of a longer trajectory, and Jack is going to be picking up the reins and really steering this work going forward in the coming chapter for what the Eco-Faith Network looks like. So I will just actually pause before I dive in. Actually, how about I just, oh, shoot, hang on one second. Technology is sometimes a struggle. Okay, but you all, yeah, are we out of screen share? No.
Nope, still in screen
There
share.
we go. Okay. Yeah, but sorry, before I jump into the slides, I just want you all to get a chance to meet Jack and for him to introduce himself as well. I'll pass to you, Jack.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Emily. So like Emily said, my name is Jack Urbanus. I am the new environmental organizer. I'm actually, this is my third week in the role. So I'm very excited to take the reins on this work that Emily is going to be talking so much about. Yeah, I'm really excited to be a part of the Synod and this organizing. Like Phoebe said, I think the Synod has done some really amazing things here in Minneapolis and the wider area around organizing, specifically around environmental organizing, and I'm excited to be a part of that work.
Woohoo! Awesome, awesome. All right, well, now that we've gotten to have those excellent words of introduction, now I will go back through my convoluted process here to do my share screen. Thanks for being patient. You would think we have this like totally down pat by this point, but hopefully it's just comforting for all y'all to know we all just clunkily make our way through this. So, all right. Good. Okay. So I love talking about local opportunities for working on energy as a key part of this bigger puzzle around climate and around environmental justice. And when we start out, I always love grounding us with what our actual stories are related to energy, because it's one of those things that even though it's kind of at the crux of a lot of what we're up against in the big picture on our climate crisis that we're facing, it can be super abstract. Like it exists in the background. I don't think about it unless I literally say it right now that, yeah, I turned on this light switch and energy is all around me and how I'm functioning in this room, from the lights that are on to the computer that's plugged in to the energy I use to boil my water to make this cup of coffee that's still the remnant of is still sitting on my desk, right? It's like, it's a part of the fabric of what we rely on and we don't think about it super often. And I really appreciated, Phoebe, that you mentioned the other part of my whole being as an artist, because I took a brief time away from my organizing at the Synod to do an art residency at Holden Village. And I'm guessing the Lutheran world here that a number of you are familiar with Holden. If folks are excited about or have spent time there, do you want to just like give a wave? Or yeah, I can't totally see all of y'all right now, but for those who don't know about Holden, it is a Lutheran retreat center and intentional community in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, and it exists on its own independent grid. So part of my energy story, what shaped my own thinking and learning about energy, was spending a winter on this small independent community's power grid that was fueled by a water hydro powered generator. And really it was fascinating for me to see, like literally over the course of a winter, as the snowpack rises, the part of the stream that was diverted for the hydropower, the snowpack would rise and it slowed the movement of the water, and you could see the kilowatt hours gradually decrease. And there were actually a number of, for those who are super nerdy about power things, you'll probably find this chart really interesting. But it really varied winter by winter, what it looked like for how much power was available. And it totally just depended on the snowpack and what winter conditions looked like in our tiny little corner of the Cascades. And what happened was that as our power availability went down, we literally made collective decisions as a community of 55 people about how we would live in relationship with each other and the power that was available. And so this image on the right was what we would move on and off the grid or restrict a certain number of hours to be able to steward the electricity available at any given moment. So I knew if I was using power tools in the wood shop to make frames for my art pieces, that I couldn't run that at the same time as before or after meals when we were running the big dishwasher to wash everybody's dishes. So we'd have to stagger it, right? Because what you pull off the grid at a particular moment is like the power that's available is just for one moment. So it was really about staggering our use and being aware of how we share power together. And that really was an informative experience for me. Like, wow, we can make these decisions together. And part of it is timing and cooperation and figuring out what we want to prioritize and how we literally live within what the landscape offers us in terms of right relationship with what's available. And I joke about the worst part of that experience, like it sounds wonderful and it was, but there was a point in the winter we had to turn off the toaster and I really missed my toast because that was the best breakfast option. And I think that's part of like what we learn though, right? Is what can we live without and where do we have to make hard decisions? And how do we do that in terms of what the collective decisions look like and how do we sometimes have a check on like, I always want exponentially whatever I want at any given moment, right? So it's a little bit of that check on our culture of consumption and a rethinking of the system in terms of how we make decisions cooperatively. So I share that as a story to ground our time and to give us a frame of reference for thinking about the grid. And also just to invite you all to think about what was that moment for you where you actually realized that energy impacts your life, whether it was a power outage or a parent always telling you to turn off the lights or a moment where you spent time in a place where you couldn't plug your phone in and what that meant for you. Because those are helpful reference points to think about how and why we do actually connect to energy in very particular ways. So in terms of demystifying our energy systems, I found this, again, I'll send these slides after, but this link was really helpful to kind of break it back into what we actually are looking at, like what our grid actually means, because there are different components to it. We think about it all as one piece, but really there are these different kind of incremental parts of what our grid is. There's generation. So how the electricity actually does get generated at some sort of power plant or point source, whether it be solar, wind, coal, natural gas, hydro, or other sources. Transmission then is how it gets transported from that like high capacity generation point somewhere then to your vicinity, if you will. Distribution then is how it gets to the specific places where it gets used. And that end use is that end use, right? So where you're plugging things in. And this is important to know because there are different entities in charge of these different points of where our electricity comes from and where it goes. So I mentioned some of these, right? But different types of generation. And I think most of us are pretty familiar with at least a couple of these. But I will admit my own novice, I'm not an energy production expert, but there's a lot to learn about the different options we have for generation and why that matters. transmission and then distribution, right, are then those two incremental spots. So like, where does the energy land in the vicinity, and how does it get more close toward you? And what are those end points? Homes, obviously, electric vehicles, and also commercial and industrial areas as well. I know slightly less about this, but I just do want to make kind of a side comment as well, that our grid does, like, there are ways that we need to think through how we make our grid adaptable as well, because as we transition those energy sources, it does really impact how the grid as a whole functions. So what are pieces can help make it resilient, and how do we incorporate storage, and how do we use smarter technology of like when we pull electricity off the grid at any particular moment, and all of these different components to how electricity gets generated and stored and how we make that adaptable. I mean, I almost think about it as like not as brittle, but like give that little kind of flow and buffer to it, so that the whole thing doesn't power down, but we do have the ability to generate and move energy in efficient and manageable ways. Finally, just to say, as we know we need to electrify everything, including transportation and things that still function very much on direct fossil fuel burning as like the source of energy. That will totally change how we deal with our grid as a whole. And this is an amazing opportunity to think about environmental justice in job creation and all the pieces that make a just and healthy transition, just, equitable, and healthy transition to a clean energy economy is all of the jobs involved with making all of this happen, right? So the different types of electric utilities are important to understand because they are those pieces in between energy being created and us. And there are three types. There are investor-owned utilities, there are rural electric cooperatives, and there are municipal utilities. And this is, I'm realizing I'm using a bunch of like kind of wonky language here, and I'll get to in a second, but this is critically important to understand. And what's exciting to me is that the further deep in the weeds you get, you actually get really close to where some exciting opportunities are. So bear with me a little bit. And if this is like old hat, props to you. And I would love to hear more about what your experiences has been in tracking this work as well. So investor-owned utilities, for each of these utility types, it's important to ask these three questions. So who are they accountable to? Who are they run by? And do they generate their own electricity, or do they purchase and transmit it? So investor-owned utilities are primarily accountable to their shareholders. They're run by company management. They're also accountable to city and state governments, but they're functionally regulated monopolies. That is literally how our system is set up. You can't choose to get your energy from a different provider. They're not in competition. You have one utility choice. And if it's an investor-owned utility, they are primarily not accountable to you. They are primarily accountable to their investors. They are investor-owned. So that's a particular relationship then that you have as a consumer to your utility. Rural electric cooperatives, however, are primarily accountable to their member owners. They're run by, actually I'm going to update this a little bit. They're run by both the board of directors and the management, right? So the folks doing the day-to-day operations. And they are also accountable to city and state governments. And you'll see our examples here. These are different ones that are particular to even our synod. So even though our synod is a smaller geography than lots of where all y'all might be coming from, we still have, I believe, 4 to 6 rural electric cooperatives, 5 municipal utilities, and 2 investor-owned utilities. So that just gives you kind of a sense that we have a lot of these around. And municipal utilities tend to be smaller, run actually by city level governments, municipalities. They're primarily accountable to residents, run by city management, and also accountable to state government. So our opportunity here is to think about, where do we have levers using the tools of community engagement and democratic participation to clarify where our goals and faith values meet the public life that utilities are responsible to. So, right, where are our goals and values as people of faith who want to show up and transform our energy systems for a just and equitable transition to a clean energy economy that works for everyone and is a part of the wholeness of God's creation. That's a part of a vision for flourishing and life that is a part of us living in right relationship and responsibility with creation, and how that directly impacts our neighbor and the creation that we cannot separate ourselves from. And so out of that vision and commitment, what does that look like in terms of what happens when we turn on the light switch, and where that energy comes from, and what impacts that has on the world around us. So that first step is understanding where your energy comes from. And then, right, this whole like wonky who makes decisions about it. And then what collective action looks like, and what are the levers of democracy we can pull to transform our energy systems. So this is a really great map. Remember how I said there's a bunch of different types of utilities? This is a map that shows you a little bit of what that looks like. If you're curious, this is just for Minnesota, but it's kind of an interesting case study. If you want to go into these slides afterward and click this link, it is interactive and it shows you what the utility, these are specifically electric utilities. So we also have a natural gas utility that is investor owned, CenterPoint Energy. But this kind of gives you a sense of the patchwork that is our energy utility infrastructure. This big sort of salmon color blob in here is our big investor-owned utility, Xcel Energy. And you see these little pockets, these small bits, those are the municipal. So like the actual city level municipal run electric areas. And then these bigger ones that kind of fan out are the rural electric cooperatives. What's interesting is that these corridors where you can see the investor-owned utilities stretching out, those were the areas that got electrified first. So the power lines basically went along these highway corridors where there was the most dense population, where this privately owned privately owned utility or an investor-owned utility was able to turn profit on selling electricity, because that's where there is the highest concentration of people. So it was actually, there was opportunity there for investment and profit. Then in contrast, the rural electric cooperatives came out of New Deal era legislation to electrify the rest of the countryside. And so you can kind of actually even see the history of that progression of our electric system in who gets served by which utilities, which is super fascinating. And I would just say a great book called The Grid by Gretchen Bachke, I believe. I can drop a link in the chat as well to that. Gives a super fascinating history of how our grid infrastructure got developed and the intentional decisions we made that shaped what that reality looks like. So again, like who makes decisions about your energy? It depends on what type of utility you're talking about. So investor-owned utilities, like I said, are directly responsible primarily to their shareholders, but they are regulated monopolies. So there is that like kind of overarching piece of regulation that is a part of what makes them functional as a monopoly system that's serving a public good like electricity, right? And so, but the other piece of that is that particularly larger municipalities like cities do have also like sort of collective buying power, as you will, if you will. So you also have direct representation at city council, for instance, that can be really compelling and be in a stronger relationship of influence with the investor-owned utility. For electric cooperatives, have literal direct representation and influence. So while there is management that runs day in, day out operations, the board of directors are directly elected by member owners themselves. So you do have an actual vote in who is in that seat of decision-making authority with the electric utility. Municipal electric utilities are a little bit different because they kind of have both pieces. They're smaller scale and you in some ways have direct representation, but sort of via city management that's responsible for them. So it's sort of in a way as direct as a board of directors, but you know, they're also sometimes city appointed folks rather than directly elected. And then again, with the regulated monopolies piece, right? And actually, all electric utilities and natural gas utilities are under responsibility of the state legislature and Public Utilities Commission that are a part of that regulatory piece. So you have direct representation at the state legislature for that influence. So again, right, like where your energy comes from, who makes decisions about it, and how we show up in powerful relationship with those making those decisions to be clear about our values and the direct asks that we have, whether in a whole variety of capacities around our energy choices and building a just, sustainable energy future. A couple things that I want to highlight in what this work has looked like in Minnesota specifically is around this rural electric cooperatives work. And part of what was my own learning and interest around this was some really great work done by our partners at CURE, an organization that's an acronym that stands for Clean Up the River Environment, that started this local energy project. And what they did was a full report card on just the basic democratic principles for every rural electric cooperative in Minnesota. And so the thing here is like, right, so if we're gonna show up in democratic engagement of our utilities, we do actually want to make sure that they're as democratic in practice as they ought to be in principle. And so here are the different things that we can score them on in terms of how they communicate bylaws in board meetings, if it's accessible to run for the cooperative board, if it's accessible how to vote in elections and what the results are from meeting minutes. So they broke this out and showed how each cooperative was doing. And many were not doing great, but some were doing fine. But it also gives you a reference point to say, hey, as a member owner, I want to know what the board meeting dates are and what the notes are. And I expect as a member owner to have access to that information. So this scorecard was a way to equip people with what the baseline is to be asking and what those points of contact are and ought to be for representation and access. And again, this is really solid work done by CURE. That's one of the leaders in local energy democracy work in Minnesota that we've partnered with on work specifically with a couple of the rural electric cooperatives in our area. This has been the most exciting part for us. Is about a year ago, we really focused in on engaging a handful of congregations in a couple particular rural electric cooperatives. This screenshot on the left was a candidate forum we did because they actually had a couple of board seats that were open that were contested elections, which is awesome because typically rural electric cooperatives 10% of their member owners to participate in the board elections. So that's a huge opportunity for us to have literal church basement conversations that can show up and have significant influence with the energy utilities that serve our neighborhoods and communities. Because we found out that having a kind of quick turnaround, we pulled this off in a couple of weeks. And a couple weeks later, we're sitting in a room with the CEO of the electric cooperative, talking about our hopes for long-term sustainability and greater percentages of renewable energy and different opportunities to expand access to energy efficiency options. And those were super powerful conversations because we showed up to participate in this democratic opportunity to be involved as people of faith and citizens of the world in a very particular local way. And we were listened to and can only continue to build that work powerfully to continue to follow through on those conversations and actually see some change, which is really, really exciting. And the last piece I'll share is just an example of what this has looked like for investor-owned utilities. This Minneapolis Energy Options campaign is a great, really phenomenal work that led to the creation of a nonprofit called Community Power that continues to be one of our strong partners as well in local energy democracy. And Minneapolis basically said, you know, we are the largest consumer of this investor-owned utility, and we have very strong hopes and to bridge our climate goals as a city with what our utilities are actually doing, and not just saying that they're doing, but really doing. And we want better citizen representation in those conversations. And if we're not seeing the outcomes we want, we could consider municipalizing our energy infrastructure. And that that series of conversations and grassroots organizing to consider municipalizing energy infrastructure made that investor-owned utility pay attention in a real hurry and led to a creation of the Clean Energy Partnership, which is basically a table with utility representation, city representation, and citizen representation all at the same table to talk about clean energy options and to be a greater lever for accountability from citizens to utility decisions. So in the slides, I will include a link to this as well if you want to learn about some of that history, because it's some really stellar organizing. And then very lastly, I will just say this Rural Power Campaign is a kind of national scale of this work as well. So this is looking at federal legislation and work around some of the big hurdles for rural electric cooperatives to support transition to clean options and sustainable grid kinds of policies. So there are lots of levels to this work, and I'm sure a lot of you have worked on or are familiar with state level policy around renewable energy standards or investments in clean energy infrastructure. And all of these things are super important and super interconnected. But I think it's really helpful to see how the decisions at the hyper-local level are part of that fabric and can often be the places where a handful of folks can lead transformative conversations that put pressure up, right, on those different layers of decision making. So with that, I will stop rambling on too long, and I haven't been looking at the chat, but I'm sure there are good questions, and would love to hear. I also recognize that there's a lot of wisdom in this room, and y'all might have some very interesting stories and perspectives to add into this as well. So yeah, I will leave it there and let us have some conversation.
Thank you so much, Emilie. I have to admit, I was doing a cute thing with a word and just said, oh, we're going to talk about empowerment. But I really do feel like you've been, all of the stories that you're sharing, even if I only absorb like a fraction of the nitty gritty stuff, the fact that you're offering so many different entry points for how we can have control over this and have a voice in this. And you offered so many different options. And again, the language. So thank you for that. Even if we have to review all these slides to get it right, those of us who are new to it. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate, taking the time to educate us because it is important. You're right. Being able to know, get into the weeds will help you do the grassroots work you need to. So I am going to ask the question. I think Lynn started with 2 of them. So I'm going to go back here and you can see them in the chat too, if you'd rather read them yourself. But how do you handle the argument that we would need to build mass amounts of wind farms and solar farms to generate the same amount of power as a few power plants? And they would use much more land. That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a big one. So I will just say my background is not in grid and electrical engineering and grid work. So I honor that these are complex systems and not, there's not one like this is immediately going to solve everything. I would say the biggest thing that we've talked about, even beyond renewable energy, is the need to do dramatic work in improving our energy efficiency. So that, is not going to be the thing that solves everything, but that's it's a lot less glamorous than solar panels when we're talking to folks in church basements. But there's huge opportunity. And if we're just transitioning to renewable sources without dramatically making those shifts that reduce the volume of energy that we're using, we're not going to make it there, right? So one of the big issues that we've worked on is rethinking how we do energy efficiency improvements, because our current system is based on folks having the financial resources to make those improvements themselves and being in that place of dwelling long enough to recoup those investments. So that is, again, making it cuts out so many folks if that's the only pathway to actually making a bunch of the realistic improvements that we need to make to reduce our energy as a collective. And so there are a number of rural electric cooperatives that have actually led the way in rethinking energy efficiency upgrades and using a pay-as-you-save model rather than the individual being on, or the burden being on individual financing, time, effort, and doing that work individually. So that's not, a perfect answer, but that kind of gives you a sense of like, couple things.
Yeah, and I saw that other people shared. Oh, go ahead.
So if I could speak to that. So yeah. I posted a link to a research paper, and I am an engineer, not an electrical one, but I'm an engineer, and I'm quite familiar with the space. So I posted a paper. When you look at land use for energy production, you have to look not only at the footprint of the power plant, you have to look at the footprint of all the mining and extraction that is going on to support the power plant. So now you are talking about all the coal mines, and you were talking about the footprint of all the oil and gas operations, maybe not oil, but certainly gas operations. So it is not just the footprint of the power plant. And to look at it that way, frankly, is it's a false argument, bottom line. So I put a link to a technical paper on the topic. It may be too technical for some people, but the basic concept is the footprint of the power plant is not just the power plant. It's the power plant plus the footprint of the extractive industries to supply the fuel to the power plant.
That's great. And thank you for the reference to, and know that the chat log and all of these details will be in a post by the end of the day tomorrow. So you don't have to feel like you have to capture all of these notes. But the other question kind of circulating here, a couple of them. One, if I'm not sure if you can speak to this either, Jack or Emilie, but understanding how wildlife is affected by wind turbines, whether they be on the ocean, which you might not talk about so much where you are, but also just in other aspects. And then I have another question from Sharon, but either of you or others that have reference with the turbines causing issues with wildlife.
I really appreciated, Lisa, you're speaking up and sharing that paper. Thank you. I will cede to the wisdom in the room if others have good, have that level of response handy.
So I'm only familiar with the impact on birds. Older turbines, there were issues. The newer turbines have been redesigned to minimize impact on birds. The latest thing I've heard is the concern around bats. So they have been improving the design over time to reduce wildlife impacts. Are they perfect? No. But frankly, a whole lot more birds are killed in collisions with buildings than were ever killed by wind turbines. So you also have to try to put these things in context.
Amen. And to that context too, Lisa, the Audubon Society, I know, often references the fact that climate change will kill more species than wind turbine.
Can I just jump in real quick, since I'm the one who asked the questions? I just wanted to kind of follow up. The thing about the land and how much and having to build all the solar panels, that was, well, if you're trying to save the land and now you're going to have to use all this land to build the wind turbines and the solar panel set, like it's that kind of a silly argument kind of thing. Like, and as far as the windmills are concerned, the wind farms, I'm in New Jersey. It's a huge discussion right now because they're thinking of building wind farms off the Jersey shore. The original opposition was, how well are we going to be able to see them, which is ridiculous to begin with, because they're going to be so far off the shore, you can't see them anyway. So I really think now their next excuse is, well, we haven't done enough research to see what the impact is on the sea life. And I was like, I'm pretty sure we have, but okay. So that's kind of, I appreciate everybody's input because to give me some more, I don't know, I don't want to say ammunition, but you know what I'm saying, more to come back at people with politely.
Yes, education.
That's the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
It's been a day. Thank you.
Thanks,
I think that's also a really good point to say that all of these decisions are contextual locally, and understanding what the impacts are on your community and what those stats are that folks in positions of decision making need to hear, and how you can be in relationship with folks across the community to understand what those impacts are, and come both with that informed, informed perspective and roots in what the outcomes are that you hope for. I mean, all of these decisions are local.
Yes. Mark, I see your hand is up.
Well, I want to echo what Lisa was saying, and just on the bird kill, I had a conversation with our Oristad person that's doing the Kansas project that we're part of, and he said, there's definitely bird kill. They do really extensive studies. They go on for years. Whether it's bats or whether it's iconic bald eagles, and the technology has changed and gotten better, but there is some mortality. We just have to acknowledge that. And I think not to belabor it, but go back to what Wendell Berry said years ago, every human action breaks the body and sheds the blood of God's creation. And it's how we do it that makes all the difference, whether it's greedily and stupidly, or, whether we are aware of what we do, as Emilie says, aware of what we do when we flip the switch.
Thank you for bringing Wendell in here. Thank you.
I have a comment.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Greg.
I have a comment that leads to a question. With regards to the comment about the use of land, of course, land is only one factor. Broadly speaking, you've got your land, but there's other things like the resources that you need, and also the labor that all goes into the cost of the product. And of course, with everything, kind of the conventional way of evaluating it is which one is the least expensive. So, for example, with solar and wind, the sun and the wind are free. So you don't spend any money on resources to produce the energy. So that really helps. And that kind of could compensate for a higher cost for land. Anyway, the question that I'm leading up to is, I've been told that solar and wind are now cost competitive and in some cases cheaper than coal and natural gas. And I'm wondering if that's correct. It probably varies from place to place. But also, is part of that benefit due to tax incentives and things like that are offered?
No.
Go ahead,
Can you
Lisa.
elaborate?
I was just going to say, generally speaking, it's true for new generation. The other thing that's also true is that the coal-fired power plants in this nation are generally speaking losing money because it is uneconomic to burn coal. There was a recent study by, was it McKinsey, one of those firms that does financial analysis on industries. I have a copy of it. I can, pass it along if you want it. But it shows that generally speaking, coal-fired power plants are money losers, but they're already on the ground, so they're continuing to operate them, right? And generally speaking, for new generation, the cheapest new generation for electricity, if you have to put in new generation, renewables have been cheaper for some years now. And I don't believe it has to do with subsidies, but I'm not sure. I just know that it's cheaper on a per kilowatt basis. I do have some materials on that I can dig up out of my files and send if you'd like.
And that's great, Lisa. And I will add that to our follow-up post too, so that, again, this is all education too. And I think to Emilie's point that especially for the options where you can communicate in context with people who, what are the concerns in your local area? And it seems like, what I'm curious about, I have a question for Emilie about, have you noticed, can you have the same contextual communication with interested parties among all three? I mean, are there different avenues? If you don't have a rural cooperative, is there another avenue to have these kind of in context communications with what power is right and just for what does the just transition look like in your context? Can you do that with big investor-owned companies? Has that ever happened that you know of?
All utilities tend to have here are our existing programs. And oftentimes, I mean, our investor-owned utility especially has a program where you can pay more to basically incentivize their investment in clean energy, even if that energy generation is cheaper. And so, I mean, there just can be a disconnect between what that looks like. And generally, if you're not coming in with here's our direct access to democratic participation, you're gonna get a list of here are the programs, or here are the things you can read about the great stuff that we're doing. And so it takes some informed digging, and it does actually take some grassroots engagement to have a group of folks together to say, no, we really want to have the second layer deeper of conversations and have a critical mass of people to actually demand those harder conversations, whether that's by inviting candidates, whether they're opposed or not, for your board director seats of a rural electric cooperative, or having a group of folks together with city leadership that is elected and does need to respond to your questions about the utilities decisions. So it's actually not like, you're not going to call up the power line, the folks who come repair the power lines and like ask these questions, or call the, even the management may or may not be responsive depending on the values and accessibility of that particular utility. But you will always get a conversation with the folks who you're going to vote for. And so that's right, figuring out who those folks are, and then coming with the right questions. And often it looks like having a few conversations where, you hear the first layer of the programs, you figure out what's happening, kind of a layer deeper, and then come back with the next level questions deeper. And that's where you start to really figure out what's working or not. And particularly when you ask like, okay, so who's benefiting from how this system operates as it is, and who's not being able to be empowered to make clean energy choices, and why? And what does it look like to change what those options are, and actually get to a greater critical mass and a more just reality with those decisions.
Wow, I don't know if you know this, but you really summed up, the reason why we asked you here today. And I know that there are a lot of other questions that I love that people are answering for each other here too, but you're especially bringing this perspective. If I will go through the questions and pull out ones that I think either you or Jack can answer in particular, or at least speak to later. But since we are near the close of the hour, I would like to thank you very, very much for speaking and for joining us, and for all the work that you've been doing in the Minneapolis Synod. And that I just want you to know that we're going to try to emulate this as much as possible. So the more you learn, it's not going to stay there. What happens in Minneapolis doesn't stay there. So please do keep sharing what you're learning. I really appreciate it. And I don't know if you know this, but I asked Jack on his first presentation with you to close us in prayer. Da-da. So thank you very much for saying yes to that. Jack, over to you.
Awesome. Well, yeah, let us pray. Thank you, God, for bringing us together tonight. We know through your word that you have called us to sustain life on earth and care for the resources we've been given. Tonight, we've shared wisdom and learned about how we can all better serve our communities in the work of powering our lives in sustainable ways. Please look over us as we go out and put these lessons into practice. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
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 Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here. I'll get this loaded tonight or tomorrow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Jack. Thank you all for sharing all the information that you all have and share, and send me more if you want me to add it to the post. I'd be happy to add more information to the posts. So email
remind me, Phoebe, about sending you the stuff from the firm that assessed the profitability of coal-fired power plants.
Yes.
And the related material. I have it in a presentation. I just have to dig it up.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.